Today, after having had an amusing breakfast at the Pension à la Mer in Swakopmund, which was presided over by a lovely Afrikaan lady who took great pride in giving us numerous egg options, we boarded a bus for a short ride back to Walvis Bay for a boat trip in search of seals and dolphins. The Ocean Lady was our boat for the morning, and we were soon on our way out into the bay. Our skipper was a lively young lass called Martinette, who was ably assisted by another Melvin. Her unique style of steering the boat enabled her to keep a sharp lookout for the wildlife. After a short while, we were joined by Ernie, one of the few wild seals that are allowed on the boat. He's a regular visitor, and Melvin had some fresh fish ready to feed him. There were quite a few boats out in the bay, all looking for a pod of dolphins, which were in the vicinity. Ernie went back to join his mates, and we were treated to our first glimpse of the dolphins. No sooner had the dolphins moved off than Ernie was back, this time siding up to Martinette, who gave us more insight into the life of the seals.
It's only male seals that come on board.
Next up, we were treated to oysters, nibbles and bubbly as we made our way out to a small seal colony on the far side of the bay. This guy was after food again, but he was not in luck. We were escorted back to the quayside by local pelicans, also after food. Altogether a most enjoyable morning. Next day we start by celebrating Hein's birthday, which we marked by giving him a lovely apple cake, which we all helped him demolish. We were still back on the road by 8 AM, heading up the beginning of the Skeleton Coast towards the Cape Cross seal colony. This Russian ship was one of many that come to grief on this treacherous coast. When we reach the colony, it's a toss-up to know which is worse, the smell or the noise. I think the smell won by a nose. There are between 80,000 and 100,000 Cape fur seals here, which thrive in the cold Atlantic waters and feed on the huge concentration of fish in the area. These seals eat 8% of their body weight each day, and over 1 million tons of fish is consumed along this coast every year. Although the small pups are quite endearing, there appears to be quite a lot of quarrelling among the population. We leave the seals, head inland, and after a long drive get to the Brandenburg Mountain, where 9 of us go for a trek up to the famous White Lady rock paintings, which are said to be several thousand years old. This was a sacred site to the Sand Bushmen, and was only discovered in 1917 by a German explorer. Unfortunately, Michael decided not to come on the trek and missed seeing this pair of African hawk eagles. After finding our lodges, we have a group meal and are treated to Namibian songs by the lodge staff. It's strange to think that today's Easter Monday, and we are greeted by meerkats on the way to breakfast. We're back on the road by 8 o'clock, looking at passing wildlife and settling in for the long drive to 12 Felfontein and more rock paintings. As we move inland, it is now much hotter and the landscape barren. Our local guide sets the scene for us, explaining how the Khoisan people painted and engraved the sandstone over 1,000 years ago, and is one of the most extensive rock art galleries on the entire continent.
Than the sandstones around here. And they were using this whole area as a ceremonial place. The human footprint.
The majority of the engravings depict animals, many of which are no longer found in the area. There are also various geometric designs and animal tracks depicted.
If you look up there, you see the big ones. They are the rhino, giraffe, kudu, and ostrich. Looks like that the stone is not in its original.
Later we drive to a small gorge that contains a 100-metre stretch of 4-metre high basalt columns known as the organ pipes. After lunch and a 45-minute drive we reach the area of petrified forests, which is said to be over 200 million years old. The remains of about 50 trees are visible, with the bark and tree rings still being quite clear. Mid-afternoon and we find ourselves at the gates of Etosha National Park. Having driven to our lodge, unpacked and freshened up, we go to our first game drive in the park. We had not been going long before we had our first encounter with an African elephant. This was quickly followed by wildebeest, numerous birds and of course the beautiful springbok. Then right on cue, a pride of lions conveniently parked in a lay-by. The day was topped off by this lone black rhino by the waterhole. "6 a.m. next day and we are at the park gates when they open, ready for a full day's drive. The jackals are resting after a busy night, and this little antelope, followed by a black rhino, tease us with a glimpse. As the sun begins to rise, Melvin spots a pride of lions moving towards us. They cross the road and disappear into the bush. However, not far behind is the large male, who decides to settle down and pose for photographs. Then we are back on the track trying to identify anything that moves. I have to confess that I am unable to remember the names of many of the birds, but I will just say the ones that I do recognise. Now this is definitely a pair of secretary birds, followed by ostrich. We saw many impala and a few even posed for the camera. Next came a bit of real excitement. This huge bull elephant was munching away quite happily until he spotted our truck. Then the situation got a bit messy. He decided to come and investigate. It was only as he got close that we realised just how big he was, and not looking very friendly. Melvin told us to keep our heads down and not to move a muscle, as he could turn nasty quite quickly. The huge beast then turned towards us and came even closer. The standoff carried on for several minutes, until with a grunt and a snort he turned and shambled off. We all issued a collective sigh of release. This giraffe seemed quite benign by comparison. The day passed on quite rapidly, with more birds and antelope and zebra, and towards the end a few wildebeest. After a long day's travel out of Etosha, through the slightly Wild West town of Grootfontein, we find ourselves in Rundi, right up on the Angolan border. We are staying overnight in the Kososi lodges, which overlook the Kavango River, which forms the border with Angola. As we sit with our beers, we can see the local farmers who move to and fro across the river between Namibia and Angola, without any form of border controls, just as they've done for centuries. It's a truly idyllic place. This morning we set off before 8 AM along the Angolan border to Divundai, 200 kilometres down the road, and by late morning we find ourselves in the Mahango Game Reserve on the border with Botswana. The landscape here is quite different, set on a verdant green floodplain where we see impala, a pod of hippos and of course elephant. At lunchtime we stop near this huge baobab tree, watch the monkeys and enjoy the scenery. We passed over the border into Botswana and arrived at the beautiful Drotsky cabins, situated on the Okavango Delta Panhandle. Tonight we go a short way down the river to join Melvin and Hein for a banquet by the campfire. Roasties, chicken kebab, steak, assorted veg and coleslaw, followed by apple and pear compote. Delicious! We all tuck in and end another brilliant day. No time for breakfast today, as we're off early in 2 boats and we'll have a late brunch when we return. It's a bright morning, although in the distance there are a few black clouds that could be coming our way. There are a lot of birds around, and we are also on the lookout for crocodile, which we are told is all around us. Suddenly the wind gets up and the first raindrops splash the water. There's nothing for it but to turn round and run for home. Later in the day, after we had all dried out and the sun returned, we were back in the boats and off up the river this time. We were soon greeted by this little crocodile, and then a fish eagle who knew that our boatman may put some food in the water for him. We all waited for the eagle to dive and were not disappointed. Here he is again, this time in slow motion. Quite a sight. later we spied this large croc who soon slid into the water under our boat. We moved quickly on. These hippos appeared at a safe distance and we watched them for a while. They then dived and surfaced a little closer to our flat-bottomed boat. Suddenly they were too close and we beat a hasty retreat, stopping only for our boatman to buy fish from a passing fisherman. By now the sun was beginning to set as we enjoyed the ride back to our cabins.